the Associate Professor at Wits School of Governance, Professor William Gumede, and he joins us for a little bit more on this. Prof. Gumede, thanks very much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the program.
Well, good evening, and thank you for having me again on the program.
When we think about Archbishop Desmond Tutu, he really was part of the fabric of South Africa's history for so long. How does one try and describe his contribution to South African life over time? Because he wore so many hats and presented himself in many platforms doing different things, but I guess all in service.
You know, absolutely. I mean, he was one of the last of the largest in life statesmen or statespersons of the anti-apartheid struggle and modern South Africa. And he also, you know, just like former President Nelson Mandela, also became at the end, you know, after the end of apartheid, a global leader, not only a South African leader, but he became an African leader, but he also became a global leader. I mean, we're so fortunate as a country to have had, you know, during our really dark and difficult days, to have leaders like truly moral leaders like Desmond Tutu, to have had them coming from South Africa.
Many people paying tribute to him as far afield as Barack Obama in the United States keep using the same word, moral compass. Speak to us a little bit about that.
I mean, it's important, you know, during the apartheid era, he spoke truth to power to the apartheid government. I mean, he took on former Prime Minister, apartheid strongman, John Foster, and also, you know, former, you know, hardman, State President P.W. Botha. But at the same time, you know, as he attacked apartheid and white racism, he also criticized very heavily the Black liberation movement, you know, when they did wrong, you know, when they had moral lapses. So that really is important. I mean, even in the post-1994 era, I mean, Tutu did not align himself, I mean, you know, just behind Black solidarity for the sake of it, to support people just because they're Black. You'll support them if they're corrupt, you know, if they're violent people, if they're incompetent. No, you know, for him, you know, speaking truth to power, whether you're white or whether you're Black. Now, that really is important, you know, that moral authority. That is why, you know, for South Africa, it was one of our, you know, for the last decades, our great moral leaders, so leaders with a compass, a moral compass, and who principles, and they stand behind that moral compass, and they don't do it for tunistic reasons, they don't do it for populistic reasons, in the way we see now currently our politics are dominated by populists, by opportunists, and by people who will support people on the basis of their color, whether they are whether they're violent or whether they're incompetent.
He was a man of God. He was a priest, and so that was his main calling. But there's no question that he was a political activist as well, and a thorn in the flesh of the apartheid regime, calling for sanctions, and often at great danger to himself.
Absolutely. I mean, he was a very courageous leader. And I know, you know, we think of him as a religious leader, but he was far beyond a religious leader. He was not confined, you know, to a leader in a religious context. Of course, he was a social leader. And of course, he was an intellectual. I mean, we often forget that he was a thinker. And for me, one of the great thinkers of the last 100 years in Africa. So, you know, he taught about reconciliation when he was unpopular, you know, the idea of forgiveness, of rainbow nations. These were intellectual concepts. Yes, we may criticize it, but he brought these kinds of concepts into our discourse. So he's also an important intellectual, African white intellectual, And that also is very important. But I think at the heart of it, he was a very courageous individual.
And one who felt deeply. I remember images of him at the TRC, where he often broke down and wept, and you could just feel the pain that he was feeling just listening to the stories being recounted.
You know, I view him as, you know, one of the great African leaders who were emotionally intelligent. And secondly, you know, who were in tune with their vulnerability. He was in tune with his own vulnerability. And he was a very intuitive, emotionally intuitive leader. Now, you know, the reason why most African countries since the end of independence has failed is because of leaders that we haven't had the kind of leaders like Tutu, who were leaders that are emotionally intelligent and leaders that are attuned with their own inner vulnerability. And secondly, also leaders that are intellectually astute. And I think that is very important. I mean, he could empathize with others because he was easily connected emotionally with others. And that's a very important, particularly in countries like our country, that comes from the violent histories, to have those kind of leaders. And it's a sad thing that he was not a leader actually in politics, you know, leading in politics, because these are the kinds of leaders that's been absolutely missing in South Africa now and also in Africa.
He also was a great ambassador for the country, traveled the world, and at many times people recognized South Africa through him. Absolutely.
I mean, he was a real ambassador for South Africa. And because of his, I mean, he was, as I say, he was a globalist. He was not a person of, you know, with a sort of confined to a village mentality. So we also have, unfortunately, again, in the South African context, and often in the African context, leaders who are tribalists and very confined to their village. Although they are national leaders, they still think as if, from the village. Now, I think an important thing that formed him, that he worked abroad. He was a priest. He was practicing abroad in the UK. I'm beginning to see that leaders with their kind of, if you've worked in another country, it does, in a foreign country, and you come back home, it does help you. It gives you a much more broader outlook and the ability to navigate difficult things and so on, and to see things in a much more bigger way rather than in a narrow and a tribalist or a village, small village mentality, but a much more, you are able to see it in a much more inclusive way. So he was a great ambassador for Brand South Africa. Wherever he went, people identified him with South Africa. Even during times when Brand South Africa was absolutely damaged, people like Desmond Tutu, and of course also other private individuals who are not part of the state, carry the South African brand, because people would say, well, if these are the kind of quality people that come out of South Africa, South Africa must be a good space in spite of all of the bad things that may be happening in the country.
His contribution during the fight for liberation and democracy, what would you say were the significant contributions that he made? One understands that, during that time, a lot of the party leaders of the various political parties were jailed, parties were banned, and he almost used the fact that he had a collar to step forward and fill that vacuum in some ways.
Absolutely. In the 1970s and 1980s, he really was a leader at home. When people were hopeless, when people were desperate, because if you think about the 1970s, 1980s, it appeared that the apartheid government, was immovable, the violence, oppression, and people, leaders were in jail. He really was, the alternative leader for those at home. And also, he was also a non-racialist. I mean, I said earlier, he was not a tribalist. He was a genuine non-racialist. So what he managed to do as a leader in the 1970s and 1980s, he brought together, blacks of all pigmentations behind the liberation struggle at home. That was quite important, and also brought white South Africans also, as part of the liberation struggle. For me, that was important, the non-racialism of Desmond Tutu, because, we as South Africa, this is the world's most diverse society. No one group can lead by themselves. I mean, the apartheid government tried with white people to lead only, and we've seen the violence, and it hasn't worked. And even in a post-apartheid era, non-racialism is absolutely crucial, and our diversity is absolutely crucial for our growth, for our development. And he was, even in the post-apartheid era, he remains a person who believed in our inclusivity. And that is why he came out with the idea of South Africa as a rainbow nation. Now that really is important, so bringing the idea of governing or being a leader during the anti-apartheid struggle for everyone, not just for one tribe, one ethnic group, or one religion even, or for one color. That is very important because as a country, Africa as a country, our diversity is actually the basis of our development and the basis of our growth. And there are, of course, many people in South Africa who doesn't think that, who think our diversity is the problem, whereas our diversity actually is, the point for growth, development, and for the transformation that you want. And Tutu was a leader who believes that genuinely.
Perhaps finally, I mean, again, people will remember him and associate him with South Africa by and large, but he was also quite interested in issues of a global nature, being sent sometimes as an envoy to Nigeria to deal with the Abiola matter. He was concerned about Zaire under Mobutu and human rights abuses. So he had a world view and was also an activist beyond our borders.
Absolutely. I mean, and that is, the wonder of Desmond Tutu, as I say, that he was not a narrow village type of leader or a narrow tribalist. He had a big view, he had a world view, and he played an important role in speaking truth to power, also to African leaders who are undemocratic, but also to world, leaders who are undemocratic. For example, I mean, he defended the Dalai Lama when, the Chinese government did not want the Dalai Lama to come to South Africa. And of course, the South African government caved in, to the Chinese government. He spoke truth to power to the powerful Chinese government. He did the same, in other parts, also in other parts of Africa. He was critical, even in the 1980s of the US. And to the point that the Reagan administration was so annoyed with him, but he stayed firm. So he spoke truth to power, not only in South Africa, not only in Africa, but also spoke truth to power to the US and to powerful China.
Professor William Gumede, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you very, very much indeed for helping us remember this giant of a man. Thank you so much.
Thank you.